much, everyone, for being here today. And thank you, Jonathan, for a nice introduction and for inviting me to give this talk. So before I get started, I want to flag that this is my newest project. So when I was doing the job interview right here, actually, a year ago, I promised my new colleagues that I'm going to work on, so just as a bit of background introduction, so I'm a logician, I work in logic, but 1 year ago, I promised that I would start doing something in social philosophy. So this is my attempt to fulfill my promise. This is my first attempt to try to step into the more socially relevant philosophy. So I'm nervous about it, but this is now my home base. So I'm talking in front of friends and colleagues. So I'm not really afraid of embarrassing myself. I don't need this to get me a job anymore. So, yeah, and also because this is work in progress, I very much welcome all sorts of comments, especially so constructive ones and also non-constructive ones. So it could be just telling me, Xinhe, stop wasting your time on this. You're not for this. Yeah. So, but I need to flag that although this is going to involve some social philosophy, there will be maths around because I don't know how to do philosophy without formal methods. So sorry about that in advance if that's not your cup of tea. Anyways, so let's get started. So today I will be talking about multidimensional concepts. So many concepts, I think, are associated with a cluster of dimensions. What do I mean by a concept? Well, I mean something like a common category that is used to classify objects or people. Now, in this talk, I will also talk about some relations. So I think some relations are also multidimensional, and my account can be nicely applied to them as well. So I will be talking about some social concepts, but some non-social ones as well. But they're, I think, all going to be philosophically interesting and important concepts. And I don't make any heavy assumption about the mathematical status of concepts in this talk. So they could be understood as mere representational device that we use to classify things, or they could have a heavier ontological status. They could be natural categories that cut nature at its joints, to use the forbidden term. So yeah, but so the bulk of my account does not depend on your metaphysical assumptions, but in the end, there might be some minor points that would depend upon that, but we will talk about that later. Okay, so what do I mean by a dimension of a concept? So I mean a contributing factor or property. So what partially makes it the case or makes it true that something belongs to the category. So putting things together, I think, and I will show you some examples in a moment, that many concepts have more than one contributing factor or property. Okay, example time. So I think many social concepts, for example, like gender categories, like women, are multidimensional. So here are some potential gender-making properties that people have been talked about. Biological or sex properties, chromosomes, genitalia, etc. Social positions, how one is presented in a community, which social norms one confirms to, etc. Psychological identification or inclination, who do you identify with, etc. Similarly, for sexual orientation categories, like homosexuality, here are some potential sexuality-making properties: sexual attraction, sexual behavior, emotional preference, sex or gender identity, or maybe even lifestyle, and many more. Similarly, for perhaps race or ethnicity categories like Black or Hispanic, here are some potential race or ethnicity-making properties: ancestry, phenotype, social and cultural factors, etc. So I don't think it's only the social concepts that can be multidimensional. So I think some metaphysically fundamental concepts can be multidimensional too. So this might be more controversial, but I think, for example, objectual identity over time is also multidimensional. So here is the familiar case of the ship of Theseus and ancient puzzle. So that's a variation of the case to suit my needs. So consider, say, the ship of Theseus has left the harbor. As time passed on, its components were gradually replaced by new ones. and when it returned, it became a ship with completely different parts. Also, someone has collected the original parts and put them together in the original arrangement. I think intuitively, both two later ships have some say of being the same ship as Theseus. And that's, in some sense, evidence for that there are at least two dimensions that are relevant to being the same ship as Theseus. One of them is spatial temporal continuity, and the other is mereological overlap or material composition, physical composition. And both two later ships are somewhat the same ship as Theseus because they each satisfy one of the dimensions, although different ones. A similar case can be made about personal identity, the identity of a person. So consider this cute example that I came up with. So Dr. Evil's operation. Dr. Evil did two things to poor Teddy. First, he copied Teddy's entire psychological profile, memories, mental characters, etc., and put it into another empty human body. So fill in your favorite sci-fi details here, like about how the human body is constructed. But yeah, and the other thing is that Dr. Evil replaced Teddy's original psychological profile with a new fabricated one. New memories, new mental characters, etc. Two people woke up from the operation. It's called one of them Tim, who has Teddy's brain and a new body, and Tim, Teddy's body and a new brain. And again, I think, at least intuitively, both Tim and Tim have some say of being the same person as Teddy. And that's reason for thinking there are at least two dimensions relevant to the identity of Teddy. So I'm sorry. In the original version of the case, I used John, but then I later changed it into Teddy because I wanted to not rhyme, but like sound similar to Tim and Teddy. But yeah, anyway, sorry. And these two dimensions seem to be relevant to the identity of Teddy. One of them, again, is material composition or physical mereological overlap. The other is psychological overlap or continuity. And again, both Tim and Tim have some say of being the same person as Teddy because they each satisfy one of the dimensions. I think there are many more other kinds of examples. So for example, consider the notion good, morally good. So I think it also seems to be multidimensional. So the dimensions could be, does the act improve utilitarian consequences? Does the act conform to moral principles or duties or norms? Or does the act come from a good moral character? A somewhat interesting example is motherhood. So I think there are presumably at least two dimensions, nurturing or raising the kid, or being the biological mother. Or there could even be a third dimension involving, is the person considered the owner of the egg that generates the baby? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And the concept healthy. So presumably one dimension could be feeling pain, the other having normally functioning organs, third one being experiencing emotional crisis. Okay, so I want to make two initial observations about the fact that some concepts can be multidimensional. I think they're interesting and important. The first observation is that the fact that there can exist many dimensions seem to give rise to the concept being gradable, the gradability. What we mean by this is that as long as the dimensions are separable, satisfaction or membership of the concept does not have to be an all or nothing matter. There could be status in between all and nothing. So let's consider, for example, some person X who satisfies some but not all dimensions of women, say the social dimension, but not the psychological or biological ones. Please take this with the most charitable reading possible, but I feel like intuitively there is some sense that we can say X seems more woman than those who satisfy absolutely zero dimensions, but less woman than those who satisfy all dimensions. Similar point, I think, can be made for almost all of the examples that I just gave. So for example, consider personal identity. So Tim, who satisfies only one of the two dimensions, seems to be more Teddy than an absolute stranger who has no other similarities with Teddy, but less Teddy than Teddy himself before the operation, presumably. Okay, so we have great ability. The other observation is that I think the existence of many dimensions also give rise to incomparability. So I think this is because different dimensions provide different kinds of reasons why X satisfies the concept, at least to some extent. And the reasons in at least some of the cases are on a par. So it is hard, if not impossible, or maybe we shouldn't compare which of the dimensions contribute to the concept more. So suppose again, X only satisfies the social dimension of women and Y only satisfies the psychological dimension. So it seems weird to me to say that X is more women than Y or Y is more women than X. So that's just something that in my mind shouldn't really be comparable. So it seems to me it's neither the case that X is more women than Y, nor the case that Y is more women than X, because the reason why they should be considered as somewhat women is completely different from each other, and they are not really on a comparable scale. So, and again, I think the same applies to the other concepts as well. So take personal identity. So Tim and Tam, they're identical to Teddy to some extent for completely different reasons. One of them is psychological continuity, the other is neurologically overlap. So I just don't think the different reasons can really be compared against one another, or at least in some cases for multidimensional concepts. So given the two initial observations, which I personally think to be quite intuitive, my goal is to develop a formal theory of multidimensional concepts that can actually capture these two features, at least. So here's my plan for the rest of the talk. I'm going to present to you a simple initial version of the account, and then I'm going to explain to you why this is overly simplified and we need to introduce two more complications. And then I will talk about the logic of multidimensional concepts under the account that I propose. And finally, I will compare my account to some alternative and argue that mine is better. Okay, so that's the rough plan that I just told you. And let's start with the initial version of the account. So suppose we have a multidimensional concept C, and we have the D1 to Dn as the dimensions. The main idea is to formally represent C as the Boolean algebra, I'm going to call it BC, generated by taking the dimensions D1 to Dn as atoms. Every object is going to correspond to a point in this algebra depending on which dimensions it satisfies. And then I'm going to give account of graded membership that is decided by the position of an object in the algebra. I'm so sorry for using the term algebra on slide 14 of the talk. So if you don't know what I'm talking about here, totally fine. I'm going to illustrate everything using simple examples in a minute. But this is just for people who are interested about the sort of background mathematical machineries. All right, so let's see an example. So here's a way to illustrate my idea. Let's say we consider the concept woman again, and let's say there are three dimensions: social, psychological, biological. I'm going to use S for the social dimension, P for psychological, B for biological. And so we could use them as atoms to generate some particular kind of structure, which is called a Boolean algebra. So we could use them to generate the 8-element Boolean algebra, which is illustrated by this figure on the left. So the idea is that every element in this algebra is generated by some ways of combining the atoms. So we have a 0 element, which is the novel combination of the atoms, basically. We also have the 1 element, which is combining all of the dimensions that you have. So 0 is at the bottom, 1 at the top, and the different ways of combining the dimensions would give you the other objects. So if you put together social dimension and psychological dimension, that's going to give you the node SP. And similarly, if you put together S and B, that's going to give you the node SB, and similarly for PB. So these are the 8 elements of the algebra. Another thing that I want to point out is that you see there are those little lines in this figure. So this is to illustrate there's a particular kind of ways to order these elements that is given to us by the structure. So the idea is that, so this is, in mathematics, we call it a Hasse diagram of the partial order. So for any 2 elements, if one is below the other, then it is less than or equal to the one that is above it. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that here the diagram is the transitive reduction of the real order. So if you can find an upward path from one node to another, then the top one is greater than or equal to the bottom node. So 0 is less than or equal to S, which is less than or equal to SP, so 0 is less than or equal to SP. It's also the reflexive reduction, so we're assuming that every node is less than or equal to itself. So I'm not illustrate that on the diagram, but it's in the background. So then we have a person's position in the algebra represented by which dimensions they satisfy. It's a simple idea. So it's at a particular node if and only if they satisfy the corresponding dimensions of the node. Say S satisfies the social and psychological dimension, but not the biological dimension, then its position is going to be here. Okay, so far so good. All right, so my initial proposal is simply the degrees to which an object satisfies the concept is directly given by its position in the algebra. So in other words, their position in the algebra measures the extent to which X is a member of the category C. So what is the extent to which X satisfies the category woman? It's just SP. Okay, so that might sound weird for trying to give grades of gender and order of gender grades, but it's not that weird when we consider there really is a partial order generated by the algebra, the one that I just described before by the diagram. So the little lines that connecting all the nodes, that gives us the order of different degrees of gender. So in general, for any objects X and Y, suppose we have Cx be their position in the algebra or their C degree, as I call them, and Cy be Y C degree, then we have X satisfies C to an extent less than or equal to Y, just in case their position in the algebra is lower than or equal to the position of Y in the algebra. Now, because the positions in the algebras are all generated by using the dimensions as atoms, this is if and only if every dimension satisfied by X is also satisfied by Y. Let's again see an example. This is a bit abstract. So let's consider 4 people U, V, X, Y, and again, the concept of women. So let's say that U only satisfies the social dimension, V only satisfies the psychological dimension. So that's our initial example. X satisfies social and psychological, Y satisfies all of the dimensions. Okay, so applying the account, we would have the degree to which Y is a woman is greater than all the other degrees, because 1 is the top node, which is above everything else. Okay. We would also have the degree to which U is a woman is less than or equal to the degree to which X is a woman. This is because U is here and X is here and U is below X. And similarly, the degree to which V is a woman is less than or equal to the degree to which X is a woman. Now, this can also be explained as it's because every dimension that U or V satisfies is also satisfied by X. So the social dimension is satisfied by U, it's also satisfied by X, similarly for the case of V. However, it is neither the case that the degree to which U is a woman is less than or equal to the degree to which V is a woman, or the other way around. This is because U is here and V is here, and these 2 nodes are simply incomparable in this diagram. There are no lines connecting them or no upward paths that lead one node to the other. They are on the path. So this is, I think, what's great about this account in compared to some alternative, which I will tell you later. So we have the ability to have a gradable account that allows incomparable middle status. Let's do another example, so that of identity. So this is the case of Teddy, Tim, and Tem. So suppose we have the concept identity with respect to being the same person as Teddy, and comes with two dimensions, psychological continuity and mereological overlap. So we just use those as the atoms to generate this 4-element Boolean algebra. And presumably, the degree to which Teddy is identical to itself is 1. So it's going to be the top node. While the degree to which Tim is identical to Teddy is going to be PC, so one of the atoms. And the degree to which Tim is identical to Teddy is MO, so the other atom. So both Tim's degree and Tem's degree will be less than or equal to Teddy's degree because one is above the other two. However, it's neither the case that Tim's degree is less than or equal to Tem's degree or the other way around, because the two atoms are on a par with each other. They are not comparable. Okay. So here is a short summary of what has happened so far. So we arrive at a gradable formal theory of multidimensional concepts. The crucial idea is that the membership degrees of a concept C comes from its dimensions. Very roughly speaking, the more dimensions X satisfies, the greater the extent to which X satisfies C. But this needs to be understood with caution. So the comparison is not made by counting how many dimensions X satisfies, but in terms of which dimensions X satisfies. So this is what essentially allows us to have incomparable C degrees. If we are simply counting how many dimensions X satisfies, we cannot have that. And which is also something that I think makes this account more attractive than the alternative, which is something that I will come back to later. Okay, so that's the initial proposal. However, the initial proposal is overly simplified for at least 2 reasons, and I'm going to introduce them one by one. So first reason is that so far, we've only given a binary treatment of dimensions. So for any dimension, an object either satisfies it or not. But some dimensions themselves might be multidimensional and thereby require a gradable analysis themselves. Second, on the initial proposal, X fully satisfies a concept if and only if it satisfies all the concept's dimensions. But this could also be too demanding in some cases. We need some way to lower the threshold in some cases. I'll give you an example in a moment. But the plan for the rest 2 mini sections is that I'm going to deal with these 2 issues by introducing 2 twists to the initial proposal. Okay, twist 1. So to help motivate the phenomenon that some dimensions might be multidimensional themselves, let's consider again women. So one of the dimensions of women is marked as social, but this seems to be multidimensional in itself. There might be the following different contributing factors: what kind of gender norms a person conforms to, someone's perceived physical features by a social group or community. This may further include what kind of reproductive ability one is perceived to have, one's perceived bodily presentation, etc. It's a point made by Ashta. How one is systematically subordinated based on the evidence of their biological role in reproduction. This includes being subordinated economically, politically, or legally. This is a famous point made by Sally Haslinger, and presumably many more. Similarly, I think for the non-social concepts, so consider personal identity. So we roughly have 2 dimensions, roughly could be labeled as mind and body. So the mind dimension, obviously, I think is multidimensional itself, involves memory, beliefs, preferences, rational capacity, dispositions, etc. The body dimension, I think, although it appears to be only involving material composition, could also be multidimensional itself if we allow a very broad understanding of what dimensions can be. I'm going to explain via a toy example. So let's assume the mereological structure of the actual world is atomic. So this is just meaning we have these little extra bits called atoms, but not in the physical sense, in the metaphysical sense, that make up everything. So let's say A1, A2 to AN are all the mereological atoms. So we could give a multi-dimensional analysis of mereological overlap, say with Teddy, in the following way. We have each atom gives rise to a dimension. So the Boolean algebra generated would be just taking all the mereological atoms as Boolean atoms. I'm so sorry for the terminology here, but people in different fields both use the term atoms, but they're supposed to be understood as different things. And for each object X, for each dimension given by an atom AI, X satisfies the dimension if and only if either AI is part of both X and Teddy or neither. So, or AI is neither part of X or Teddy. Okay, so then the extent to which X mereologically overlaps with Teddy is determined by which dimensions it satisfies, in this case, which mereological atoms it shares with Teddy. Okay. So that's just trying to motivate that a seemingly one-dimensional concept like mereological overlap might also be given a multidimensional analysis. All right. So if there really are multidimensional dimensions, then the initial proposal has a trouble because we have no room for multidimensional dimensions. An object X either satisfies the dimension or not. Mathematically, this could be represented as, so let's say we have a dimension D, then D could be represented as the function that takes X to 1 if X satisfies the dimension and 0 if it does not, which can be further represented as the two-element Boolean algebra, which only have two elements, 0 and 1. So 1 on top of 0, obviously. And Dx is going to give you the position of X in this Boolean algebra. So this is all quite trivial. And then our initial proposal could be turned into something along the following. Please bear with me on that. This is the relatively most mathematical part of the story. I'm going to stop this very soon. And there's a point that I want to make here. So again, let's consider C, multidimensional concept with dimensions d1 to dn, and the previous Boolean algebra we constructed by using the dimensions as atoms, BC, is then isomorphic to the product algebra of taking all the copies of two together, one corresponding to one dimension. And the location of X is given by the sequence of all the dix, which is really a sequence of zeros and ones. So each position corresponding a particular dimension, it's 1 if it satisfies the corresponding dimension and 0 if not. So all of this is just a different way of presenting the initial count. The difference is mathematically trivial, but the reason why I am showing you this is because this gives us a natural way to generalize the count to account for multidimensional dimensions. How do I do that? Well, the thought is simply we're going to use the same method of taking product algebras to deal with dimensions. So the thought is that instead of now for each dimension, we only allow it to be represented by the two-element Boolean algebra 2. We allow it to be represented itself by a more complex algebra. So in particular, we use the subdimensions of a dimension as atoms to generate a more complex Boolean algebra. And then we use all the algebras for the dimensions, take the product algebra of that to generate the algebra for the original concept. So the initial proposal becomes a special case when each algebra for the dimension only has two elements. Okay, so now the extent to, So let me put this formally. So now suppose we have a concept C, the algebra of C is now given by the product algebra of all the algebras for the dimension di. So B sub di is the algebra for the dimension di. And the extent to which X satisfies C is the sequence d1 of X to dn of X, where d1 of X marks, say, the extent to which X satisfies d1. So that's going to depend on the dimensions of d1 itself, and so on and so forth. And similarly, before we would have an ordering of the grades of C in the following way. So for any xy, X satisfies C to an extent less than or equal to y, just in case, as before, its position in the algebra for C is less than or equal to y's position. That's if and only if for every dimension di of c, di of x is less than or equal to di of y in the algebra for di. That is if and only if for any dimension di of c, x satisfies that dimension to an extent less than or equal to y. To make things less abstract, let's go back to the gender example. So let's consider again a woman with 3 dimensions SPV, and let's just assume the dimension S itself has 2 subdimensions, S1 and S2. This is all just for simplicity, could have more. And also for simplicity, let's assume both P and B are binary dimensions. So we would have an algebra for the dimension S itself. It's the 4-element Boolean algebra generated by taking S1 and S2 as atoms. Now, let's say X satisfies S1, Y satisfies both, and Z satisfies none. Then the degree to which Z satisfies the social dimension would be the sequence 0, 0. The degree to which X satisfies the social dimension would be the sequence 1, 0. And the degree to which Y satisfies the social dimension would be the sequence 1, 1. And 0, 0 is less than or equal to 1, 0 is less than or equal to 1, 1. So that's for the social dimension, but adding into the other considerations for the concept woman, then we have the algebra of woman, it being the product algebra of BS, this algebra here times 2, because we assume the other 2 dimensions correspond to the 2-element Boolean algebra. Now let's say, suppose Z further satisfies the psychological dimension, while X and Y satisfy no other dimensions. Then the degree of X satisfying C, or in this case, woman, will be this sequence, while that's the sequence for Y. And you can see C of X is going to be again less than or equal to C of Y, because every single position is less than or equal to that in Y. However, the degree to which Z satisfies C will be 0, 0, 1, 0. That's incomparable to either CX or CY. So the judgment is that neither Z is more woman than X, or is it more woman than Y, or any way of the other way around. Okay. So that's the first twist. So we've handled embedded multidimensionality. So now we need to do the second twist. So what is the second twist? So let's go back again to the mereological toy example. So if we use the initial proposal, then we would have that X mereologically overlaps with Teddy to the degree 1, if and only if it shares all the mereological atoms with Teddy. But this consequence might seem too demanding if we want to use mereological overlap as one of the dimensions for identity. Presumably, we would want to say that Teddy survives after losing just one atom. Let's say there's an atom that is on like a piece of hair of Teddy that is about to fall off or whatever. So we wouldn't want to say Teddy just died after losing that hair. So the initial proposal then is too demanding, and we need some way of imposing a threshold, ideally below 1, which could mark a sufficient extent of overlapping that does not affect identity. And to this end, I'm going to make a second twist to the original proposal. And there has to be a little bit more mess, I'm sorry, but that's the final notion that we need, actually. So bear with me, we're almost there. So here's the second twist. For some multidimensional concept, membership of the concept is decided by a suitable filter on the algebra of the concept. And an object fully belongs to the category if and only if its location in the algebra is in the filter. So a filter is kind of like a special subset of the algebra. In particular, F, a subset of B, is a filter if and only if the top element is in F, so 1 is there. If P is there, then anything, if P is there and P is less than or equal to Q, I don't know how the typo comes from, then Q is in F. So it's like an upward corn in some sense. So if some point is there, then everything above the corn is there. And finally, if P and Q are both there, then the greatest lower bound of P and Q is there. Okay. So the idea is that we're going to use a particular future for particular cases to set a threshold, and which future we should use depend on the particular situation. Let's say, for example, of mereology again, let's say there are countably infinite many mereological atoms. We now want to, so the original measure is going to be 2 to the omega. Now, so omega is countable infinity. If you don't know what it is, just ignore this side entirely and come join us in 1 minute. Sorry. So the original measure would be 2 to the omega, and we want to convert this into a more tolerating one that presumably measures the extent to which an object sufficiently overlaps with Teddy. So a potential suitable future that could do this could be the Fauchet future on omega. So this is also the cofinite future on omega. So it's the set of all subsets of omega that is cofinite, meaning that the complement of the set is finite. So for example, the complement of the set consisting 1 and 2 would be cofinite, but the complement of the set consisting of the even numbers wouldn't be cofinite. Okay, so if you take all the cofinite sets, that's going to be a future. And we could potentially use that to set a threshold for an object being sufficiently overlapping with Teddy. So then X would sufficiently overlaps with Teddy to the degree 1 if and only if the amount of atoms it shares with Teddy is in this future, i.e. it's infinite. Or, sorry, cofinite. Okay, so let's go to a better example. So some concepts, especially social ones, can be dynamic, meaning that their meaning or even extension can change over time. And the future method, so that's another cool thing about it, I think can be used to capture the dynamic aspect of my multidimensional concepts. So here's one way a concept can change. Some old dimension no longer contributes to being a member of the category anymore. So this can be captured by using a filter to filter out the dimensions that now we don't want. So consider again the concept woman, 3 dimensions SPP, and suppose now the only dimensions that matter are the social and psychological dimensions. The biological one doesn't matter anymore for whatever purpose. We may then take the principal filter generated by S and P in the original algebra. So that's going to be the set of all elements in the original algebra that is larger than or equal to both S and P. So it's easy also to check that this is a filter. Now, we are going to use this filter to set a new threshold for being fully a woman. So now X satisfies, let's say this new concept is W star. So now X satisfies W star to the degree 1 if and only if W of X is in the future, if and only if X satisfies the dimensions S and P. So we filtered out the biological dimension. The new concept then, I suggest, is going to given by the quotient algebra of the original measure under F. I'm going to explain that in a moment. So the point here is that by using the filter to set a threshold, we do not transform the original concept into a binary concept. The new concept, W star, as I will show you in a minute, is going to be gradable as well. How does that work? Well, because every filter in a Boolean algebra canonically gives rise to a quotient algebra, which is also a Boolean algebra. So I'm not going to explain to you the canonical transformation because that's going to take me 3 more slides of mathematics and I don't like it. But roughly, the idea is just elements in the quotient algebra are sets of elements that are the same from the perspective of the filter. So for example, in our example, X and Y satisfy W star to the same degree if and only if they are the same with respect to the social and psychological dimensions. For example, let's say X satisfies the dimensions SP, Y satisfies SB, and Z satisfies PB. So now in the new algebra for the new concept, W star, we would have W star of X being 1 because it satisfies both dimensions that now matter. However, both W star of Y and of Z will be less than 1 because they do not satisfy both social and psychological dimension, but just one of the 2 that currently matter. However, that doesn't mean that they now satisfy the new concept to the degree 0. because the transformed algebra is still going to be more complex than 2. In particular, we would have the result that the degree to which Y satisfies the new concept is still incomparable to the degree to which Z satisfies the new concept, and vice versa. So roughly, although the biological dimension does not matter anymore, but which of the social and psychological dimensions one satisfies still matter. And this is, I think, a good result that I like. So after the transforming, we still have a gradable formal representation that allows for incomparable middle status between 0 and 1. And summing up a little bit, so here's roughly the status of my account as it currently stands. So we have a multidimensional concept C being formally represented by the product Boolean algebra of the algebras of all of its dimensions. In the special case where the dimensions are binary, this is isomorphic to the power set algebra of the dimensions, or the Boolean algebra generated by taking all the dimensions as atoms. Membership is determined by X position in the algebra, that is, by which dimensions X satisfies. The extent to which X and Y satisfy C could be incomparable if the dimensions it satisfies come apart. When needed, we can use a suitable filter to adjust the threshold for full membership. Okay, so I think I won't have time to talk about the logic of multi-dimensional concepts, so I'm just going to skip this. If people are interested, I could talk about this during Q&A. But roughly, the headline is that we have a very neat logic of concepts, if you like my account, because it's classical consequence. So that's given by the proposition here. So I have this sharp entailment relation that's coming from my account, and it's equivalent to the classical consequence relation in classical propositional logic. Okay, so I'm going to use the final 5 to 10 minutes to do a bit comparison. So in the literature on multidimensional concepts, especially as it is discussed in psychology and neuroscience, the most predominant proposal is this theory that comes from Peter Gardenforst. So here's a very rough sketch of the view. So again, we have C, the concept, and its dimensions, D1 to Dn. So under Gardenforst's account, each dimension Dn is assigned a real valued measure. So the real interval 0, 1. 0 meaning least satisfaction of the dimension, 1 meaning most satisfaction, the most natural way. Now the concept C is then formally represented as a region in the n-dimensional Euclidean space, which is generated by a particular point. So the point is considered to be the prototype of the concept. And there was going to be an enclosed region surrounding the prototype that's considered the concept itself. And and each object X is given a point in this Euclidean space. Membership of C is decided by the distance between the point of X and the prototype of C. So, and distance is calculated normally using the metric distance. So that's the distance relation here. Okay, so that's the view. Now, you can see that both my account and Gardenforst's account measure membership in some way in terms of how an object satisfies the multiple dimensions of an object, of a concept. But there are some important differences, and I want to argue that at least for some purposes, my account is better. So here's the first difference. So Gardenforst's account represents difference in dimensions between two objects using a single numerical value. Okay, so that's the distance between the object and the prototype. But this is, I think, losing important information, as sameness in metric distance does not always mean the same thing. So let's suppose X and Y are equidistant from the prototypical moment W. But it's because the difference between X and the prototype along the social dimension is the same as the difference between Y and the prototype along the psychological dimension. And let's assume both X and Y are exactly the same as the prototype in other dimensions. Okay, so the other distances are 0. Now, if we use Garden-Force account, then X and Y would be the same with respect to gender membership on Garden-Force account. So no matter how you assign the region, because the distance is the same, they have to be the same. However, I think this seems to be overlooking an important difference between X and Y. I don't think the gender positions of X and Y should be the same, basically. Because one of them has a difference in psychological dimension, which is completely distinct from the social dimension. And in general, by sort of conflating the differences in dimensions into a single numerical value, we lose structure. And so my account, in some sense, has more structure than Garden-Force account. And in general, more structure means more information. And I think that's a good point. Okay, so the second thing is that because Garden-Force account adopts a metric measure, it cannot have incomparable middle degrees. They cannot have two objects that somewhat satisfy the concept, but the degree to which they satisfy the concept are incomparable to each other. So that's impossible if we use the metric measure. This is simply because, well, a metric measure is linear. So the smaller the distance, the closer X is to the prototype, the more X satisfies the concept. And you could always compare the degree to which any two objects, X, Y, satisfy the concept. Now, I think this is bad in some cases. Consider again the previous example. No matter which degree you assign to X or Y being women, because they have to be the same. The biconditional X is a woman if and only if Y is a woman will come out fully true to the degree 1, which I think is counterintuitive. So if X differs a little bit from the prototypical woman along the psychological dimension, Y differs somehow along the social dimension, then presumably and assume neither of them is determinedly woman, then presumably we wouldn't want to say X is woman if and only if Y is. Because X is woman, for example, if and only if we change our conceptual understanding about women along the social dimension and the other way around. Okay, and finally, Garden-Force account relies on prototypes, but my account have concepts more directly constructed out of the dimensions. This could be a benefit for me too, because you might think some multidimensional concepts may not have a prototype structure. For example, I think it is pretty controversial whether social concepts like women has a prototypical structure. So if we don't really need to rely on prototypes, then that would be good. Okay. So I'm going to use the final few minutes to talk about some further research questions or some questions that I am currently thinking about. So I'm happy to talk more about them during Q&A. So the first one is on the section that I skipped. So basically, the results that I had that I currently have on the logic of concepts only consider sentential connectives, not the quantifiers. So I get classical propositional logic, but the question that naturally arises from that is that can I get classical predicate logic? And I don't know because but I have some idea to solve the question. I think I just need to use more complex algebraic structures. So with Boolean algebra, I don't think I have enough resources to prove what I want to prove. But if we move to this kind of algebra called cylindric algebra, which is Boolean algebra plus a special set of operators called cylindrification, then I could potentially deal with the quantifiers. Sorry about the nonsense. The second one is that, is it possible to use my account to explain prototypicality? So I sort of present the lack of prototypicality as a benefit of my account, but I think it could also be a disadvantage because there are indeed multidimensional concepts which seem to exhibit a prototype structure. So I don't know right now. A rough idea that I have is that maybe you can use the prototypes as dimensions. and go from there, but I'm not sure. And finally, so another difference between my account and Gardenforge is that he uses a metric measure for the dimensions. I use a Boolean algebra. Now, there might be dimensions that you may think should be given a metric or continuum measure. In that case, my account has a problem. So is there a way to build a hybrid account to take the benefits of both? I think maybe they can. I think maybe we can, and it could be because of the fact that there is a shared topological structure that underlines both my account and Gardenforge. I'm happy to go into more details, but roughly, if you represent everything in topology, then everything that I just talked about using Boolean algebras can be talked about using stone spaces, while for Gardenforge, you can use weakly scattered Alessandra spaces, of which the stone spaces are a special kind. Anyway, so you can maybe give a topological semantics for the multidimensional concepts that have the benefits of both, but I haven't worked out the details yet. Anyway, that's what I have for today. Thank you very much.